The storm had a name. They called it the Veil, a roiling, sickly green tempest that tore across the wastelands of Vega 9, swallowing everything in its path. Zane had been watching it build on the horizon for hours, an ugly bruise spreading across the dying sky. He knew better than to be caught outside when it hit. The rain it carried wasn't water. It was acid, strong enough to eat through metal given enough time. That was why Vega 9 was nothing but a graveyard now. It had once been a thriving colony world, full of promise, full of life. Now, it was a rusted husk where only the desperate and the damned remained. Zane wasn't sure which of those he was anymore. He tugged his hood lower, adjusting the strap of his satchel. He'd been out scavenging, picking through the remains of an old supply depot for anything worth trading. Not much luck. A few rations, a half-spent energy cell, some scrap that might fetch a few credits back at the outpost. Not enough. It was never enough. As he moved through the wreckage, the wind picked up, howling through the jagged metal ruins. The first drops of rain began to fall, sizzling as they met the ground. Time to move. He turned toward his bunker, his so-called home, when something caught his eye. A shape, barely visible through the thickening mist, slumped against the twisted hulk of a downed transport. At first, he thought it was another corpse. Vega 9 was littered with them, skeletons of those who had come before him, people who had gambled on this planet and lost. But then it moved. Zane stopped. The figure shifted slightly, trembling, barely holding itself upright. A gust of wind pulled at the tattered remains of a suit, too sleek, too refined for a scavenger. And then he saw her face. Even through the rain, he could tell she wasn't human. Her skin was a deep, iridescent blue, marred by fresh burns where the acid had eaten through. Long black hair clung to her face, soaked and tangled. And her eyes, large, deep violet, filled with something between confusion and pain, locked onto his. Zane clenched his jaw. Walk away. That was the smart move. Stranded aliens meant trouble. They usually had enemies, and Zane had made enough of those on his own. He'd survived this long by staying out of things that weren't his business. And yet, she wasn't just injured, she was dying. The acid rain had already begun to eat through her clothes, her exposed skin blistering from the exposure. Even if she could stand, she wouldn't make it far. Zane exhaled sharply, fingers twitching at his side. You know how this ends, Kane? He flinched at the name. It had been years since anyone called him that. Kane the Butcher. Kane the Mercenary. Kane the Traitor. He wasn't that man anymore. He'd left that life behind, left them behind. But he still remembered. He remembered the last time he'd hesitated. The last time he'd had a choice. And he remembered the body he hadn't been fast enough to save. Something in his chest twisted. Damn it, he muttered. Without another thought, he ripped off his cloak and sprinted toward her. The fabric hissed as it met the rain, already fraying at the edges, but it would hold for now. He threw it over her, shielding her as best as he could. She flinched, eyes widening as he crouched beside her. Up close, she looked even worse. Her breathing was shallow, her fingers twitching weakly against the ground. Hey, he called, shaking her shoulder. You still with me? She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, her body gave a sharp, involuntary shudder. Too late. Zane didn't hesitate. He hooked an arm under her knees and lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, her frame too thin, too fragile. Hold on, he muttered. The wind howled around them as he ran. Each step burned as the rain seeped through his sleeves, but he didn't slow down. His bunker wasn't far, just past the ridge, built into the remains of an old cargo bay. If he could just get there before. A sharp gasp cut through the storm. Zane glanced down. The woman's violet eyes fluttered open, dazed and unfocused. She stared up at him, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to say something. Instead, her fingers weakly clutched at his jacket, gripping it as if holding on to him was the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. Something about that made his chest tighten. He pushed forward, boots slamming against the ground. The bunker came into view, a rusted steel door barely visible through the mist. Almost there. He slammed his shoulder into the door, kicking it open. The sudden silence inside was deafening. The rain, the wind, the howling storm, all of it was cut off the moment the heavy door sealed shut behind them. Zane staggered forward, laying the woman down onto the old cot in the corner. For a second, he just stood there, breathing hard, the weight of what he'd just done settling over him. She was still alive. Barely. Her skin was still burning in places, fresh acid burns standing out against the blue of her arms. He needed to neutralize the damage. Fast. Moving on instinct, Zane grabbed a canister of medical foam from the shelf, shaking it hard before spraying it over the worst of the burns. The foam expanded, hissing as it sealed over her wounds, stopping the spread of the acid. She winced, her body tensing for a moment, but then she exhaled, her breathing easing slightly. Zane sat back, rubbing a hand down his face. What the hell had he just done? For a long moment, he just watched her. She was still unconscious, but up close, he could see the delicate features of her face, the faint markings along her temples, some kind of tattoo or insignia. A soldier? A noble? A fugitive? More questions. More trouble. She stirred slightly, her brows drawing together. Then, to his surprise, her eyes fluttered open, locking onto his. You, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Why? Zane exhaled, leaning back against the wall. He let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Hell if I know. Her lips twitched slightly, like she wanted to smile. But before she could, the exhaustion dragged her under again, her eyes slipping shut. Zane watched her for a long moment before glancing toward the door. The storm raged on outside. But inside, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone. And that changed everything. The silence before an attack was always the same. Zane had been in enough fights to recognize it. The eerie stillness, the way the air itself seemed to tense, holding its breath. Instinct prickled at the back of his neck, an old survival reflex honed from years of knowing when someone was about to make a move. He sat near the entrance of the bunker, his rifle resting across his lap, fingers lightly drumming against the metal. The storm outside had finally died, leaving the world eerily quiet. Too quiet. Silva stirred on the cot behind him, letting out a faint groan as she shifted. He glanced over his shoulder. Her violet eyes fluttered open, still hazy with exhaustion. Where are we? She murmured. Safe, Zane answered, though he wasn't entirely sure how long that would last. Silva exhaled and pushed herself up on her elbows. She still looked weak, her dark hair tangled from sleep, her blue skin marked with fading burns from the acid rain. But there was something sharp in her gaze now. Awareness, calculation. She was assessing, piecing things together. You carried me, she said after a moment, voice quieter. Zane huffed a dry laugh. Yeah, well, you weren't exactly walking on your own. She studied him for a long moment, then shifted, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. Thank you. Something in her tone made him pause. She said like she wasn't used to saying it, like she wasn't used to needing to. He shrugged, turning his attention back to the rifle in his hands. Don't mention it. Then the motion sensor near the door flickered red. Zane stilled. His fingers immediately tightened around the grip of his rifle, his body tensing. Shit. He reached for the small monitor on his wrist and tapped the screen. A distorted feed from the sensor outside appeared, revealing 3 heat signatures moving toward them. Not scavengers. Not locals. Bounty hunters. Zane let out a slow breath through his nose. He should have known it wouldn't take long for someone to come looking. People like Silva didn't just disappear without someone sending guns to retrieve them. They found us, he muttered. Silva stiffened, her expression shifting instantly to something colder, more guarded. How many? 3, maybe more, he said, standing. Standard approach, no rush. They think they've got time. He moved to the supply shelf, grabbing extra ammo. Bad news is they're right. Silva swung her legs over the side of the cot, her hands gripping the edges for balance. You should leave me, she said, though there was no real expectation in her voice. Zane snorted. Yeah, let's pretend that's an option. She gave him a sharp look. I mean it. If they take me, you walk away. This isn't your fight. Then why are they at my door? Zane shot back. Silva didn't have an answer for that. Outside, the sound of boots on wet ground grew louder. Zane pulled the safety off his rifle, pressing his back against the bunker wall. "Stay low," he told her. "If I go down, you run." "Got it." Silva's gaze darkened, but she nodded. Then the door exploded inward. Zane barely had time to move before the blast rocked the bunker, sending metal shards and dust flying. He dropped low, rolling behind cover as three armored figures stepped through the smoke. The leader, a heavy-set man with a scar down his neck, scanned the room, his visor glowing red. "Told you," he muttered to his squad. Tracker led straight to her. The second bounty hunter chuckled, raising his weapon. "And look, someone's been playing hero." His visor turned toward Zane. "Real bad luck, friend." Zane didn't answer. He just fired. The pulse round slammed into the second hunter's shoulder, sending him staggering back. Before the others could react, Zane was already moving, rolling to the side and taking another shot. The third bounty hunter dodged, just in time, returning fire. The energy blast seared past Zane's head, close enough that he felt the heat. He ducked behind a crate, cursing under his breath. 3 against 1. Fantastic odds. Then, out of nowhere, Silva moved. Zane had expected her to stay down, to wait for an opening. But instead, she was already in motion, fast despite her injuries. She darted behind the nearest hunter and grabbed his arm, twisting hard. The bounty hunter let out a grunt of surprise. But before he could react, Silva had yanked his own weapon free and jammed it into his ribs. A single point-blank shot. The man dropped without a sound. Zane didn't have time to be impressed. The leader turned towards Silva, raising his weapon, but Zane was faster. He fired, hitting him square in the chest. The man stumbled, armor absorbing most of the impact, but the distraction was enough. Silva grabbed the last remaining bounty hunter's rifle, flipping in her hands before delivering a sharp crack across his head. He crumpled. Silence. Zane let out a breath, lowering his rifle. "Remind me never to underestimate you again." Silva wiped the back of her hand across her face, still breathing hard. Noted, the bodies lay motionless at their feet. Smoke still curled from the edges of the broken door. Zane nudged one of the bounty hunters with his boot, his mind already racing ahead. "This was a retrieval squad," he muttered. "They weren't here to kill you." Silva grimaced, rubbing at the mark on her arm. "They wanted proof of death. A body to bring back. Which means they're reporting in," Zane said. "And whoever sent them is going to realize they're not coming back real soon." Silva swore under her breath. Zane glanced at her, his expression serious. "We need to move." Silva met his gaze, something unreadable in her eyes. Then she nodded. They both knew what this meant. This wasn't over. Not even close. The fire crackled low, its flickering light casting long shadows against the damp stone walls of the cave. The storm had finally passed, leaving only the distant rumble of thunder and the faint hiss of acid rain evaporating off the jagged rocks outside. The air inside was thick with the scent of smoke and damp earth, a stark contrast to the cold metallic bite of the wasteland beyond their temporary shelter. Zane sat with his back against the rough stone, his rifle resting beside him. His muscles ached, bruises forming where he had slammed against the cave floor during the fight. The cut on his jaw still throbbed, a sharp reminder that their so-called victory had come at a price. Across from him, Silva was awake now, propped up on her elbows, her long black hair falling in tangled waves around her face. The firelight gave her blue skin a soft glow, but Zane could see the exhaustion etched into her features. She was still recovering, still worn from the fight and the hell she had been through before they met. "You're staring," she murmured, her voice rough with fatigue. Zane huffed, shifting his gaze to the fire. "Just making sure you're still breathing." "Not dead yet," she said, attempting a smirk, but it faded quickly. She exhaled, pressing a hand against her ribs. Zane watched her for a moment before reaching for the med kit beside him. He pulled out a small vial of antiseptic and a roll of fresh bandages. "Let me see your arm." Silva hesitated, her fingers twitching slightly before she reluctantly extended her forearm. The silver-marked skin beneath the torn sleeve shimmered faintly in the firelight. Zane gently unwrapped the old bandage, frowning as he examined the wound beneath. The medical foam had done its job, sealing the worst of the acid burns, but the edges were raw, irritated. His touch was careful as he applied the antiseptic, but even so, Silva sucked in a sharp breath. "That bad?" she muttered. Zane's lips twitched. "I've seen worse." Silva raised an eyebrow. "On yourself or someone else?" Zane didn't answer immediately. His hands worked with practiced precision, movements careful, efficient. "Both," he said finally. Silva studied him, her expression unreadable. "You were a soldier." It wasn't a question. Zane let out a slow breath, securing the bandage before leaning back against the wall. "Something like that." Silva tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her violet eyes. "Let me guess. You don't talk about it." Zane smirked without humor. "You catch on quick." Silva didn't press, but the silence that followed wasn't empty. It hung between them, filled with things unsaid. After a moment, she reached out, brushing her fingers lightly over the cut along his jaw. Zane stiffened. "You should have let me treat this earlier," she murmured, her touch lingering. "Didn't seem important," he muttered. Silva's fingers hesitated against his skin. "You are," she said softly. Zane's breath hitched. For a moment, neither of them moved. The warmth of her touch burned more than the wound itself. It wasn't just the physical contact. It was the way she was looking at him, like she saw something past the walls he had built. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to smirk. "You always get this sentimental when someone patches you up?" Silva rolled her eyes, but didn't pull away. "Shut up." For the first time in longer than he could remember, Zane let himself relax. "Just a little." "You never answer my question," he said after a beat. Silva arched a brow. "Which one?" "The one about who's hunting you." Silva's expression darkened. She slowly withdrew her hand, shifting her gaze back to the fire. "My people marked me," she said quietly. "Branded me before I even ran." Zane's jaw clenched. "That tracker in your arm?" "More than a tracker," Silva murmured. She pulled back the sleeve of her shirt, exposing the intricate silver lines that ran beneath her skin. "It's a biological failsafe, a way to ensure I can never truly disappear." Zane frowned, watching the faint glow beneath the surface. "So they can always find you." "Not exactly. It doesn't transmit constantly. More like a dead man switch. If I die, they know immediately. If I survive long enough, they make sure I don't." Zane swore under his breath. "That's insane." Silva let out a dry, humorless laugh. "That's the point." Zane exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He had seen plenty of messed up things in his time, but this was something else. "You were important to them," he muttered. Silva nodded slowly. "I was a researcher. I developed technology, weaponized things that should never have been weaponized. When I realized what they were using my work for, I tried to destroy it. But they were faster. They made sure I could never be more than a liability." She swallowed hard. "And now I'm a loose and they need to tie up." Zane's grip tightened around his knee. "Do you regret it?" Silva blinked, turning to him. "Running," he clarified. "Do you wish you'd stayed?" For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then, finally, she shook her head. "No," she whispered. "I'd rather die free than live under their control." Zane watched her, something unreadable in his expression. She looked back at him, and suddenly, she wasn't just some runaway scientist, wasn't just another person trying to survive in the wasteland. She was like him, someone who had walked away from something they could never truly escape. A long silence stretched between them. The fire crackled softly, the only sound in the cavern. Then, before he could second-guess himself, Zane said, "If we find a way to remove that mark, what happens next?" Silva blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Zane exhaled, "if we actually manage to get that thing off you, no more tracking, no more failsafe. Where do you go?" Silva stared at him, as if the thought had never occurred to her. "I don't know," she admitted. Zane studied her for a long moment. Then he leaned back against the wall, crossing his arms. "Well, guess we'll figure it out." Silva gave him a long look. "We?" Zane smirked. "Yeah, princess. We." For the first time that night, Silva smiled. Not a smirk, not a mask, but something real. And for the first time in years, Zane realized he might actually mean it. The fire had burned low, its embers casting a dull glow against the cold stone walls of the cave. Outside, the world had settled into a deceptive calm. The storm had passed, but its aftermath remained. The distant hiss of acid rain eating away at the jagged rock formations, the charred remnants of the land left broken and scarred. Zane sat against the cavern wall, absently running a cloth over the blade of his knife. The rhythmic motion kept his hands busy, but his mind was elsewhere. He should have been focused on their next move, on the fact that they had just killed a retrieval team, on the fact that more would come, and soon. Instead, his attention kept drifting to her. Silva sat on the other side of the fire, her long black hair falling messily over one shoulder as she inspected the weapon she had taken from one of the bounty hunters. She had stripped it apart, fingers moving with the kind of practiced precision that told him this wasn't the first time she had handled a rifle like this. She was still recovering, still exhausted from the fight, but she was awake, alert, stronger than she had been. And Zane couldn't stop watching her. She must have sensed it because she smirked without looking up. If you have something to say, just say it. Zane huffed a quiet laugh, setting his knife aside. Just wondering where you learned to handle a rifle like that. Thought you were a scientist. I am, Silva said, sliding a piece of the weapon back into place. But even scientists need to know how to defend themselves. She glanced at him, something unreadable in her expression, especially in my line of work. Zane studied her, noting the way her fingers moved with certainty, the way her violet eyes stayed sharp despite the exhaustion weighing on her. You ever kill anyone before today? Silva's hands stilled for just a fraction of a second. It was so quick, so subtle, that most people wouldn't have noticed. But Zane did. She exhaled softly, setting the weapon down beside her. Not like that, she admitted. Zane leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. You regret it? Silva didn't answer right away. She stared into the fire, her fingers brushing absently over the silver markings on her forearm, the brand that had condemned her to a life of running. Finally, she said no, but I don't know if that makes me a better person or a worse one. Zane considered that. He had asked himself the same question too many times to count. He still didn't have an answer. Doesn't matter, he said finally. Silva arched a brow. Doesn't matter? Regret or no regret. It doesn't change what happened, Zane said. Doesn't bring them back. Doesn't erase what's already done. Silva tilted her head slightly, studying him. You sound like you've had practice convincing yourself of that. Zane smirked without humor. Maybe. A long silence stretched between them. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy, the kind of silence that carried weight, meaning. Then, Silva did something unexpected. She reached out, brushing her fingers lightly along the edge of the cut on his jaw. Zane stilled. The touch was brief, barely there, but it sent a sharp jolt through him, something hot and electric. You should have let me treat this earlier, Silva murmured. Didn't seem important, Zane muttered, his voice lower than before. Silva's fingers lingered a moment longer before she let them drop. You're bad at letting people take care of you. Zane huffed a quiet laugh. I don't need taking care of. Silva smirked. Sure, keep telling yourself that. For a moment, neither of them moved. The fire flickered between them, casting shifting shadows across their faces. Then Silva spoke again, quieter this time. You never told me why you stayed. Zane's smirk faded slightly. What? Back at the bunker, she said, watching him closely. You could have walked away. Hell, you should have. But you didn't. Zane exhaled through his nose, leaning back against the wall. He considered lying, telling her something easy, something that wouldn't dig too deep. But something about the way she was looking at him made him want to tell the truth. Because I've been where you are, he said finally. I know what it's like to have the entire damn universe telling you that you don't get to decide your own fate. And I know what it's like to wish someone gave a damn. Silva stared at him, something shifting in her expression. Then, to his surprise, she smiled. Not the smirk she usually wore. Not the sharp, teasing grin she used as a defense mechanism. A real, genuine smile. Well, she murmured, I guess I got lucky. Zane swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. Before he could respond, Before he could even process the warmth curling in his chest, Silva leaned in. It wasn't rushed, wasn't hesitant, just inevitable. Her lips brushed against his, soft and warm, and Zane's entire body tensed. Then instinct took over. He kissed her back. The shift was immediate, like something that had been building between them had finally snapped. Silva's fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer. Zane responded in kind, one hand slipping to her waist, the other threading through her hair. She was warm, solid, real. And for the first time in years, Zane let himself forget everything else. He didn't think about the bounty on her head, didn't think about the people hunting them, didn't think about the fact that he was making a mistake because it didn't feel like one. All that mattered was her. Silva pulled back slightly, her breath warm against his lips. Her violet eyes searched his, something flickering in their depths, something unspoken but understood. "You really are bad at being alone," she murmured. Zane smirked, running his thumb lightly along her jaw. "And you're really bad at making good decisions." Silva grinned. "Yeah." Then she kissed him again, and for the first time in a long, long time, Zane didn't give a damn what happened next. The wasteland was silent. Too silent. Zane knew what that meant. He had been in enough battles to recognize the weight of an ambush before it happened. The air was too still, the distant echoes of the storm already swallowed by something heavier. Anticipation. They were being watched. His fingers twitched toward the rifle slung over his shoulder as he scanned the terrain. Jagged metal ruins stretched across the barren land, twisted remnants of a world long abandoned. The sky overhead was a dull, sickly green, the last remnants of the storm fading into the horizon. Then he saw it, a glint of movement in the distance. Not much, just enough to confirm what he already knew. "They found us," he muttered. Silva crouched beside him against the rock formation, barely tensed. "How many?" "Too many." Her violet eyes narrowed as she peered into the distance. Zane followed her gaze and spotted them. A formation of black-armored soldiers, moving in precise lines, their rifles drawn and ready. No scavengers this time. No bounty hunters. These were enforcers. Silva's people had finally come for her. Zane exhaled sharply, gripping his rifle tighter. "They sent a damn squad." Silva swallowed hard. "They won't stop until I'm dead." Zane glanced at her, his jaw tightening. "Then let's make sure they don't get the chance." A distant whirring sound sent a chill down his spine. His eyes snapped to the sky. Drones. Sleek black machines hovered above the battlefield, scanning the area with sharp, mechanical precision. Their red lights flickered in unison, locking onto them. "Shit," Zane growled. "They've got surveillance." Silva was already moving. She reached in her satchel, pulling out a small, disc-shaped device. "Give me cover. I can jam them." Zane didn't hesitate. He fired first. The first shot hit one of the soldiers square in the chest. His armor absorbed the brunt of it, but the impact still sent him stumbling backward. The squad reacted instantly, raising their weapons and returning fire. Energy blasts screamed through the air, slamming into the rocks around them. Zane ducked, rolling behind cover as molten shards of stone rained down. His ears rang from the concussive force, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving. Silva, hunched over the device, worked quickly. The drones overhead beeped sharply, their lights intensifying as they locked onto her signal. "Almost there," she muttered. Zane cursed under his breath, popping up just long enough to fire off another round. This time, he aimed for one of the drones, catching it in its sensor. It exploded midair, sending shrapnel spiraling toward the ground. But there were more. The soldiers pushed forward, flanking them from both sides. One of them launched a grenade. Zane barely had time to react before he grabbed Silva and pulled her down, shielding her as the explosion ripped through the rock wall behind them. They hit the ground hard, dust and debris filling the air. Silva coughed, but her hands never stopped moving. Just a little. A sharp, piercing noise filled the battlefield. The moment Silva activated the jammer, the drones flickered erratically, their lights failing one by one. Sparks erupted from their engines as they spiraled out of control, crashing into the ruins below. Zane didn't waste the opportunity. He swung his rifle back up and charged. The first soldier that got too close found himself on the receiving end of Zane's elbow, the impact knocking his helmet sideways. Before he could recover, Zane slammed the butt of his rifle into the man's visor, cracking the glass before firing point-blank into his chest. The body dropped. The others kept coming. One tackled Zane from behind, slamming him into the ground. Zane grunted, rolling with the momentum before twisting, locking his arm around the soldier's throat. The man struggled, but Zane was faster, stronger. With a sharp, brutal movement, he snapped his neck. The lifeless body slumped against the dirt. He turned just in time to see Silva fighting off two of them at once. She wasn't as strong, wasn't as trained, but she was smart. She used her smaller size to her advantage, dodging and weaving between their strikes. One of them grabbed her wrist, but she twisted, driving a hidden blade into the gap between his armor plates. The man screamed, dropping to his knees. The second soldier raised his rifle. Zane fired first. The last shot echoed across the battlefield. Then silence. Zane was breathing hard, his muscles burning from the fight. Blood dripped from his knuckles, some of it his, some of it not. Silva exhaled shakily, wiping sweat from her brow. Is that? A sudden beat from her arm cut her off. Zane's stomach dropped. The mark. It was glowing, pulsing. Silva's eyes widened. They're activating it again. Zane moved fast. He grabbed her wrist, examining the mark. It was spreading, the silver veins glowing brighter, seeping up her arm like it was infecting her body. She gasped, her breath hitching. I can't. Zane knew what was happening. They weren't just tracking her. They were overriding her. Fight it, he ordered. Silva shook, her muscles locking as if an unseen force was controlling her. Her violet eyes flashed with pain, panic, fear. I can't. Zane gritted his teeth. He had seconds. Seconds before they took her from him. Yes, you can, he growled, gripping her face. Listen to me, Silva. You're stronger than them. They don't own you. Her breath shuddered. Zane, look at me, he demanded. You're not theirs. You never were. Her fingers clenched into his shirt. She was fighting it, struggling against whatever signal was trying to steal control. Then, she gasped. The mark flickered, and then it died. Silva collapsed forward, barely catching herself against his chest. She was shaking, her entire body trembling from the exertion. Zane held her close, his grip steady, grounding. You did it, he murmured. Silva's breath was warm against his neck. I thought I was gone. Zane closed his eyes, his jaw tightening. He had almost lost her, really lost her, and that terrified him more than anything. Not on my watch, he muttered. Silva pulled back slightly, her violet eyes searching his. There was something raw in her gaze, something unspoken, something real. Zane didn't know who moved first, but suddenly his lips were on hers. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't desperate. It was relief, a silent promise, a declaration without words. Silva melted into him, her fingers twisting into his jacket, holding on like he was the only thing keeping her anchored. And maybe in that moment he was. When they finally pulled away, their foreheads rested together, their breaths mingling. Zane smirked just slightly. So what now? Silva let out a small, breathless laugh. We run. Zane grinned. Then let's get moving. With the rising sun at their backs, they didn't look back. They had won, and they were free. The sky above Vega 9 had never looked so open. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was no one chasing them. No mercenaries. No soldiers. No drones hovering overhead, tracking Silva's every movement. Just the endless, quiet expanse of the wasteland stretching before them, bathed in the golden glow of the rising sun. Zane stood near the remains of the battlefield, the distant smoke from the fight already starting to fade into the horizon. His body ached, bruises forming where fists, gun stocks, and shrapnel had made their mark. But none of that mattered, because they had won. He turned to look at Silva, who stood a few feet away, gazing down at her arm. The tracking mark that had controlled her haunted her, nearly killed her, was finally gone. She flexed her fingers experimentally, as if expecting it to react, to glow, to pulse beneath her skin. But didn't. It was just skin now. It's really over, she murmured, half to herself. Zane smirked, stepping closer. Took you long enough to believe it. Silva turned to him, and for the first time since he had met her, there was no fear in her eyes. No hesitation. Just something lighter, freer, something that made his chest tighten in a way he wasn't ready to think too hard about. I thought I'd feel different, she admitted. Like there'd still be some part of it left. Some part of me still trapped. She exhaled. But it's just gone. Zane studied her for a long moment. So what now? Silva smiled. A real, genuine smile. I was hoping you'd have an answer for that. Zane huffed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. I never planned that far ahead. Silva stepped closer. The wind stirred her long black hair, the morning light casting a faint glow against her deep blue skin. She was tired. They both were, but beneath the exhaustion, she looked at peace. It was a good look on her. You could leave, you know, she said after a moment, her voice softer now. You're not tied to this. To me. Zane arched a brow. You trying to get rid of me, princess? Silva smirked. No, just giving you an out. Zane crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly. Well, that's stupid. Silva blinked. What? Zane took another step forward, closing the space between them. I didn't go through all this trouble just to walk away now. Silva searched his face, as if trying to figure out whether he was joking. He wasn't. A slow, knowing smile curled at the edge of her lips. You're terrible at making smart decisions. Zane grinned. Yeah, well, so are you. A beat of silence. Then, before he could talk himself out of it, he reached up, cupping the side of her face. Silva inhaled sharply at the touch, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into it. Zane kissed her, slow and deliberate. Not out of desperation, not out of fear, but because for the first time in years, he wanted something more than just survival. And for the first time in years, he wasn't alone. When they finally pulled away, Silva let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head. You really are terrible at being alone, aren't you? Zane smirked. Guess not. The wind carried the distant hum of the wasteland beyond, but it didn't feel empty anymore. Not like it used to. They had survived. They had won. And this time, they were free to choose what came next. Silva laced her fingers through his. Let's get out of here. Zane squeezed her hand. Yeah, let's go. And together, they walked toward the rising sun.